On President Obama's European trip, how to reset EU-US relations damaged by the Prism spying scandal after his national security agency tapped other leaders' phones. The world's two largest trading partners and allies need each other to face global crises. But how can Obama win back trust without looking soft on security? With European elections approaching, Europe's leaders are under pressure to look firm on defending privacy and against industrial espionage. Can Obama and Europe's leaders see eye to eye, or will differing national interests prevent a reset? What impact on the crises at hand? Hello, I'm Chris Burns, and welcome to The Network, hard talk with a matrix of newsmakers. Joining us on this program, here at the European Parliament in Brussels, Marietje Schaake, member of the Delegation for Relations with the United States and of the Alliance for Liberals and Democrats group, or ALDE. In London, James Rubin, former State Department spokesperson during the Clinton presidency. And at the Euronews studio in Brussels, Ian Lesser, Senior Director for Foreign and Security Policy at the German Marshall Fund. Welcome to all of you. First, a question to all of you, and starting with Marietje. How much is the Prism spying scandal affecting relations now, especially with regard, say, to solving the Ukraine crisis? Insiders are telling me that there is a problem, that the trust has been broken. Marietje.
Well, absolutely, the trust has been broken. I think the fundamental question for our citizens and also for politicians is really in Europe, what does it mean, our alliance? If there's no trust, then the meaning of this alliance is under serious pressure, and I'm sure we'll feel the impact.
Jamie, what are you hearing from your side?
Well, I'm sure that the crisis over the intelligence revelations did some damage in the run-up to Russia's takeover of Crimea. But we're now into a whole new situation where the reasons for NATO are clearer and clearer. I think the threat from Russia will probably bring people together and make that intelligence issue fade to the background.
Ian, is that what you see, or what do you think? I mean, the Europeans are hopping mad about this intelligence issue still.
Well, I think my view is probably somewhere in between the two views you've heard. I quite agree with Marietje that this has really posed a problem for trust, especially at the level of publics, but not just publics, also politicians. On the other hand, I think this kind of a crisis over Ukraine brings geopolitical realities to the forefront, and so I don't think it's that much of an impediment.
Okay, well, what about? I mean, there was a spying, but then there was also that outburst from Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, making a derogatory reference about the EU. How did you take that, Marietje?
Well, it was very unelegant, let me put it that way, and I think it's not the way in which alleged allies should speak about each other, even if they believe they're talking in private.
But did that really, okay, so what? But did that really affect relations, or there are people saying, well, that was just a moment of blowing off steam?
No, it was extremely unelegant and unhelpful, and I think we were more surprised that the US government is not using encrypted phones. But on top of all the revelations of the NSA, I don't think this did that much more damage. I think it underlines the need for EU leadership, and I think we should have taken a more proactive and unified position vis-a-vis the Ukraine, and in that sense I can imagine American frustration.
Okay, Jamie, what do you think? I mean, did that hurt relations, Ms. Nuland's outburst?
The bottom line is, in the run-up to the Ukraine crisis, neither the EU nor the United States will win any diplomacy awards. It hasn't been handled beautifully. What has to happen now is that Mrs. Merkel and the United States primarily need to get it together, figure out how much pressure to put on Moscow, and then do it.
Okay, Ian, what about, let's switch gears a little bit. What about the free trade agreement? How much is that in danger because of this break of trust?
Well, I think this is actually a more serious point because, you know, the geopolitical crisis over Ukraine concentrates minds in a certain very direct way, and I think these kinds of issues will be put aside. When it comes to something like TTIP, you know, in parliaments, elsewhere, these issues of trust, public opinion, this plays a real role.
And so do you think that's going to, is that going to delay a reaching of a free trade agreement?
Well, I think unfortunately, there are a lot of things that are coming into play that are delaying it and making it was always a complicated, hard thing to do. Yeah. But this doesn't help, for sure.
Okay, Marietje, right, you're pretty intimately involved in this TTIP negotiations, free trade. Do you see it being slowed down by that? How much damage from these intel revelations?
Well, I think the trust issue, again, is very important, not in the least place because our European Parliament has to give a thumbs up or thumbs down at the end of the road of the negotiations. And our publics, whether they are critical about environmental standards or worried about genetically modified foods, they now have another reason to be opposing TTIP. And I think that is not helpful. And I think the United States strongly underestimates what damage the NSA revelations have done.
So, Jamie, how do we fix this? I mean, aside from the fact that these crises are pushing us together, what could Mr. Obama say or do to reassure the Europeans that we can put this spying scandal behind us?
I think in the context of Russia's newly posed threat, it's time for the West, the United States, and its European allies to have a new approach to NATO that takes into account defense capabilities, intelligence capabilities, and political cooperation, and adopt some new policies on terrorism, on intelligence, and on dealing with Russia. And in that context, I think we can deal with it.
Ian, how do you see that? How could we fix those relations?
Well, look, I think out of the crisis and the diplomacy over it now across the Atlantic, one thing is going to be very, very clear, and that is this question of the United States still caring about Europe and transatlantic relations is going to be resolved. I mean, obviously we do. The Obama administration is putting a lot of effort and time into this. All this question of the U.S. pivoting away from Europe, I think, is going to become less pressing for Europeans. And that's, I think, a contribution to trust in its own right.
Okay. Mauricio, what about the fact that we've heard just a few days ago that the U.S. plans to cede control of the Internet to an international body? How much could that maybe reassure the Europeans that the U.S. is not going to be listening so much to their phones?
Well, that should be convincing through actions and not words. I do think it makes sense that the U.S. recognizes the global character of the Internet and the fact that there needs to be a global sense of responsibility for keeping the Internet open. And whether we're talking about the Internet or surveillance or security, I refuse to accept that security and freedom have to be zero-sum. And I think that that's a balance that the U.S. has to strike again.
What about this kind of dilemma? Mr. Obama and his Democrats are facing elections coming up. They have to look tough on security. The Europeans are coming up with elections. They have to look tough on privacy. How do you try to resolve those two and show that these relations between the two are more harmonious because of this crisis? Jamie?
I think for him, his legacy is going to be determined by how the United States and Europe manage the crisis in Crimea and all that flows from that. I think the pivot probably wasn't an unfortunate approach that misled Europeans into thinking that the United States no longer felt the same ties to Europe that it can and does. Look, when something goes wrong in the world, whether it's Crimea or Libya or Syria, we're not looking to India and China and Japan to help us solve these problems. America is looking to Europeans.
Okay. Ian, what about, yes, these elections on both sides of the Atlantic? How much is that? Could that make it difficult for these leaders to get together? You
know, the truth is, I think, with regard to surveillance and security and privacy issues, Americans and Europeans at the public level really don't view this very much differently. We've done some polling that shows that, and others have as well. I think it's a question of getting the balance right, as has been said. But again, I think there will be a very strong focus on transatlantic relations simply as a result of what's going on in the world, and I think that'll do a lot to restore trust.
Okay, Jamie, does anything remind you of when you were a State Department spokesman during the Clinton administration? I'm sure he faced some difficult times with his European counterparts. How do you compare that to now?
Well, I think the difference between now and then is that at those days, the feeling from Europeans was that the United States was over-involved, over-engaged. That's when French Foreign Minister Védrine labeled the United States the hyperpower. I think today the fear is that we are retrenching. The United States is not engaging in the world. And all I can say is that perhaps the crisis in Crimea is going to be a wake-up call for Americans and for Europeans, that America needs to continue its role as the indispensable nation, working with its partners, not doing too much, but not doing too little.
Thanks to all of our guests, Marietje Schaake, James Rubin and Ian Lesser. I'm Chris Burns, and until next time, thanks for connecting with the network.